Of you and a warm welcome once again to IMA webinar series. Before we start, I would like to make a small presentation. So, as you know, the topic of today's talk is India Moving, the Migration Challenge. And we have Professor Chinmay Tumbe, faculty IIM Ahmedabad, to deliver the talk. Let me share that the views and opinions expressed in this series are of the speakers and not of IIM Ahmedabad. The talks will be conducted regularly. Saturday 4 p.m. would be the preferred time, and you may note the time in your calendars. Please feel free to share the invites with your friends and colleagues. There is no restriction whatsoever. The webinars are attended by people who have intellectual and academic interests. So there are no certificates for attending these webinars. I write this because I keep on receiving requests of giving certificates. There is no such procedure. The talk is telecasted live on YouTube also, but somehow today I'm not able to enable it. Access to 300 users is on Zoom, rest are on YouTube. The webinars are attended by people, yeah, that's I already mentioned. You may ask questions on YouTube also. The host today for you, the host is myself, Sanjay Verma. So I will read the questions for you from Zoom as well as YouTube on behalf of audience. And question and answer will be at the end of the talk. So this is about the talks. Now let me share something about Professor Chinmay Tumbe, who is going to deliver the talk today. Chinmay loves to laugh and learn. He's a faculty member in the economics area at IIM Ahmedabad, and he's author of the book India Moving, A History of Migration. He has published migration for a decade and has served on policy making groups and has worked in India and UK, Italy, and US. He was the 2018 Alfred D. Chandler Jr. International Visiting Scholar at Harvard Business School and the 2013 Jean Monnet Fellow at the Migration Policy Center, European University Institute, Florence. Before IMA, he was a faculty member at the Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Hyderabad, and have been a student at the London School of Economics and Political Science, Indian Institute of Management, Bangalore, Ruia College, Mumbai, and Rishi Valley School, Badenpally. Also, let me share with you that Chinmay loves sports, and in evening when he's not doing academic work, you can see him playing cricket with children. He also loves football, and he's regular member of IMA faculty team whenever they play cricket with students. Welcome, Chinmay, to you in this series, and you will speak for around 45 to 60 minutes, and then we'll take question and answers. Welcome, Chinmay, and the floor is yours now. Thank you.
Sure, thanks a lot, Sanjay. This is a fantastic series that you started, so I'm absolutely thrilled to be here. What I will be doing in the next 40 minutes is giving an overview of migration as it is in India, but more pertinently with respect to the current issues of the last 2 months, about what has happened, why it has happened, what is likely to happen in the next 1 or 2 months, and in the immediate, say, future of a year, and how we should really all start thinking about migration in India. So the first 10 minutes, I'm just going to give you a very brief overview on why people migrate in India, where are they migrating, what are the new corridors, and so on. Then give you about 5 or 10 minutes about some of the policy options of the last 2 months and in the immediate future. And I have already started getting some questions, and so I'll also start addressing that within the 40 minutes slot as well. And I'd like to take more questions because I know a lot of people are very curious to know about migration. So I'll try and speak less and hear questions more. So I'll start with this basic paradox that we have in India. That is often we think that when we think of migration, we think that it must be the fact that the poorest of the poor move, because why else would a person migrate? But let me start with this, interesting paradox in India, where the poorest state of India on almost all dimensions today, which is Bihar, and the richest state of India almost on all dimensions today, which is Kerala, both have the same rates of out-migration, which means, just think about it. Bihar will take about 3 or 4 decades to reach where Kerala is today on, health, incomes, variety of things. But there is absolutely no guarantee that out-migration will fall, because Kerala, where it is today, already has a huge out-migration, mainly towards the Persian Gulf countries. So the first idea that, it's poverty driving migration, or many commonplace notions that rural development or development more broadly will reduce out-migration, these actually are not really borne by the data. In fact, what we find often in the case of India and many other countries is that with more development, often you get more out-migration. So how does one really think of all these different issues regarding migration? So what I'll do is I'll start by just talking about three broad kinds of migration, especially for work. Note that when you talk of movement or just people moving, the biggest migration in India is, of course, migration for marriage. Virtually every adult woman in India is a migrant, because if you leave your town or village to a new family across the village border and so on, you are classified as a migrant. Migrant meaning just based on change of place of residence by the census or the national samples. So in India, we have actually over 300 million women migrants just on account of marriage. And of course, this is reciprocal, which means, say, along Bihar and UP border, there are villages which send women across from Bihar to UP and vice versa. Balance out on the interstate basis. Though in some states like Punjab and Haryana, which have fewer women because of a variety of issues, if you look at the younger age groups, there are fewer women, and so when you actually reach marriageable ages, there are actually fewer women in those particular age groups, and so you have something called as bridal migration into Punjab and Haryana, mainly from eastern India. But apart from that, most states balance out each other on the case of female migration for marriage. The next biggest reason for migration, of course, is work. People leave for work, and that's what we're going to focus on in this one hour. That is what we call as the migrant worker, because all these images that we're seeing on our televisions is mainly about the migrant worker. And there are mainly three kinds in India. One is the permanent migration worker, which means this person has left a particular place, gone to another place, and is there for many years. Permanent in the sense of not that you leave one place, go to the other side, and are there for life, but you're there for many years, and you don't have an intention to go back. For example, I've now spent, I've lived in various cities of the world, and I'm currently in Ahmedabad, but I don't have any intention as of now to go back to Mumbai, place I was brought up in. That's one type, and I suspect that almost everyone on this webinar would classify ourselves either as a non-migrant, which means you're there in the place of your birth, or you're a migrant, but more of the permanent kinds. This is the minority of work-related migrations in India. So there's one permanent. The other side is what we call as circular migration, and that is really what this migration issue right now of the last 2 months is about. And within circular migration, you have two types, what one can call as seasonal short-term vis-a-vis semi-permanent migration. And the seasonal short-term is really, we are talking about migration spells of 2 or 3 months, typically distances which are not very far, typically in work, stations like construction, bricklaying, farm harvesting, rural farm operations. These are spells of migration of 3 or 4 months, where the bulk of the year, the migrants are actually at home, and they go out in the off season of the agricultural calendar. Right? So this is one class of migration, and this happens mainly from central India. These are migrations where the poorest of the poor actually tend to move more, precisely because they don't have enough money to stay in the city or wherever they're going for long periods of time. So they're going for very short periods of time and coming back. This is also not the majority of migrations in India. The majority of work-related migration in India is this third category called the semi-permanent migration. Right? And out here we're talking of migration typically for 10 to 11 months of the year, that the person has left either the village or the small town, typically gone to a big city, could be abroad, it could be also to a village, but spends about 10 months of the year outside, goes back typically in the month of June and July for rice sowing or setting the fields during the monsoon, and then going back. So these are literally 10-month migrations where typically the man moves out, the woman is back home looking after the family. And now these are huge migrations in India, okay, and together with the short-term seasonal make up this bulk of the circular migrant workforce of India. Note in this second type, that is semi-permanent, it is actually not the poorest of the poor who move out, which means the richer you are, the more likely to move out. It's more if you're born in a sort of, it's the higher ranking castes have more out-migration. If you have some land back home, you have more out-migration. So what are the broad numbers in these three kinds of migration in India? It's very challenging to put a precise number because there are various problems in actually measuring circular migration. For example, the census often does not go to construction sites. So how do we know how many people actually live in many of these places? But researchers argue now that broadly there's a consensus. There are over 100 million migrant workers in India, the bulk of them which are circular migrants. And this is roughly about a quarter of the workforce, which means if you look at the overall workforce, which is over 400, close to 500 million people, they're saying about a quarter of this is migrant. Within this, I would argue that about 1/3, which means about 30 million people, are interstate migrants. Right? So just to give you a broad sense of the numbers, more than 100 million circular migrant workers, the bulk of this being intrastate, that means people are moving across districts or within districts within the state, and about a quarter to a third of this, so about, I would put a number 20 to 30 million people who are moving interstate. These numbers could be more depending on different measurement choices. Now, where are these people moving? And I'm just going to show you one map. I don't have a PPT, but I'm going to show you a particular map. So let me just get the screen. Right, so what you can see now on your screens is a map of India. And you'll see all the red spots, which are the hot spots for out-migration. And so not surprisingly, these are the places of India which have come in the news recently, that is Bihar. So you see this place out here, Bihar, this eastern Uttar Pradesh. Note, it's not all of Uttar Pradesh, but mainly eastern Uttar Pradesh, which sends out people. So this part of the Gangetic Basin is one of the world's biggest out-migration pockets. And you have a place in coastal Odisha, which is also huge. It sends out a lot of people. Where do these people go from coastal Odisha? Most of them work in the state of Gujarat, where I'm based currently. A lot of people from this pocket, eastern UP, Bihar, go pretty much all over India. There, a lot of them, in fact, go all the way down south now. But historically, they used to go to Delhi, Punjab, and of course, Surat, Mumbai, and so on. Then you have the Himalayan economies, which is Uttarakhand and Himachal Pradesh. Huge part of Delhi's informal workforce, is sourced from this region. You have a huge cluster from Rajasthan now, which sends out people again across India, a lot to Ahmedabad. You have clusters within almost every state of India. Even Gujarat has some districts like Amreli, Bhavnagar, which sends a lot of migrants, especially the diamond cutting, sort of diamond polishing centers of Surat. Then within Maharashtra, you have the famous Konkan belt in Ratnagiri, for example, which has been sending out people for a long time. And you have this entire sort of west coast belt from south of Mumbai to Kanyakumari on the one side of the Western Ghats, which is very migrant prone. And note that this is one of the richest parts of India. So on the one hand, you have a very poor part of India here, which is Bihar and Uttar Pradesh, which sends out a lot of people. And then you have an extremely rich part of India, which is the west coast of India, which also sends out a lot of people, but mainly to the Gulf, either to Mumbai or to the Gulf. Right? And so it's not just Kerala. It's from Kanyakumari to Mumbai, south of Mumbai, on one side of the Western Ghats. It's a huge out migration. So if you ever travel there, you'll see two things. One is Western Union boards because of this remittance market, and other is this persistent shortage of labor, which they complain about. And precisely because they've been going to international destinations, becoming rich over many decades, those parts of India do not want to do the sort of low-end jobs anymore. And so the west coast of India itself now draws in a lot of migrants from the rest of India, especially northern India. And so Kerala, for example, today has about 3 million people outside Kerala, that is, who work in the Gulf. But they have almost now close to 3 million people inside Kerala who have come from northern India working out there. So it's a very interesting place where people are going out, becoming rich, not doing the low-end jobs, and the low-end jobs being taken over by North Indian. And similarly for Tamil Nadu, which is also a relatively richer state, people coming from the north and so on. Now, one of the things that you see in this map is the broadly empty spots in the middle part of India, that is the Deccan Plateau. You'll see that it's in relative terms that these migration outspots are lesser. It's not the fact that nobody's moving. Of course, people are moving, but it's lesser than Bihar, UP, and so on. But there are these 4 circles, and those 4 circles are about the seasonal short-term migration that I talked about. So that's a much shorter end migration, whereas the red spots are those 10-month migrations. And where are those 10-month migrations going to? They're mainly in the jobs that you see a lot on the streets. For example, the people selling us vegetables, the security guards on various campuses around India, the variety of plumbers, carpenters, a huge urban informal economy, not to mention the manufacturing clusters of India. This is what we call as the 10-month migration cycles. So in India is the country on a move, but some parts of India move much more than the others. And broadly, you'll see that the Deccan Plateau is less prone to. You might want to ask, what explains this? The fundamental factor that explains this is population density. That is, regions of India which are very high rural population density tend to have much higher out migration, and that is why, though we say Bihar is a very poor state and Kerala is a relatively richer state, both have same rates of out migration because both have extremely high rural population density. Right? So what's common between Kerala and Bihar is very high population density in rural areas. Not cities by definition have high population density, but we're talking of high rural population density. And this is because of history. This is because of a long, continuous sort of unbroken cycle of civilization in these places, which have in the 19th and 20th century led to very, very high densities, and similar for many parts. The other reason, of course, is history. Migration basically builds on networks. A lot of these migrants, how do they come to the city in the first place? In the shorter term, seasonal migration, almost always you have a contractor. You have a labor contractor who gets these people into the city. But in the longer term migrations, it is not the contractor, but the family members who ensure that you come to the city. So your chacha or mama, is a person who tells you about a job and then you move to the city. Now, most of these guys who are moving are men. The ratio is something like 80-20. That is 80% of out migrants being men, 20% being women. And that's because of a variety of factors. Often cities do not provide spaces for women. It's not very safe for women, so they don't move. But more often than not, it's because of norms in the source region about who can move. So typically, if you ask the Bihari migrant worker, why is your wife not here in the city? He will tell you two things. One is that it's quite unsafe in the city to get my wife out here. And two, who will look after my parents and land back home? So there are particular norms about what men and women have to do in these migration systems. And most importantly, because these red spots that you're seeing on this map have been red spots for so long, we're talking in the case of Bihar or in the case of even the Konkan, that is Ratnagiri, we're talking of regions which have been sending out migrants for more than 100 years. So these are generations and generations of people who have been sending out. Okay? And so if you're a child who grows up in the Konkan, it is basically your condition that you will spend a large part of your life outside and you will actually come back home at some point. So this is this rhythmic pattern of circular migration where often you spend almost 20 years outside, but eventually you retire back. So here's an interesting thing that, in fact, most, especially Mumbai, Delhi, Surat, people who move from rural areas to cities, most of them actually go back, right? And so every time you see young new people coming in, they're usually replacing older migrants who are actually going back. It's not the case in many other cities. For example, you look at Bangalore, you look at Hyderabad, you look at Pune. These are cities which are quite different from Mumbai, Surat, Delhi, because more than 50% of the migrants to those cities actually come from other urban areas, which means the class and profile of the migration work vis-a-vis, say, Mumbai, Delhi, Surat, which were historically manufacturing cities, but they have sustained migrations. They provided opportunities and networks for people coming from very remote parts of India, especially rural India. So different parts of India have these different migration histories, different migration propensities. But what's quite common across the board is a very, very high percentage of these migrations being circular in nature. Now, why is migration in India so circular? One argument is, of course, on gender, that is, women don't move. And the minute only the man moves, the migration automatically has to be circular because the man eventually has to come back. But it is also the case that cities themselves can be fairly hostile, which means often it is very tough to get a foothold in the city. So, for example, in Marathi, there's a saying, Jechi kholi techi Mumbai. That means whoever has a house in Mumbai can basically live there. Whoever can pay the rent in Mumbai can live there. But often housing is so exorbitant that it's very tough to get a foothold in the city, which means all your strategy of migration is to save, remit money back home so that you can build a nice home, and go back and retire to that nice big house that you're going to make back home, rather than actually invest and buy some property in the city, because that is seen to be out of bounds. Now, note, cities of India do provide substantially higher wages, and that is why migrants move in the first place. And so we say that cities of India provide some sort of economic security to migrants who move in aspiration of work and so on. But at the same time, the source region, that is villages, provide social security because your family is back there. And more importantly, because we don't have portable social security in India, what it means is that if you want to have subsidized welfare services provided by the government, the minute you leave, say, Bihar and come to Mumbai, you lose access to all of that. Or you enter a black market of ration cards and so on. Which means a lot of people also want to go back home because you have access to much cheaper or subsidized state services, which you don't have access to in the destination. Now, having said this, that these numbers are large. We're saying almost 100 million workers, a third of them interstate. A lot of them living these circular lives. What happens when you announce a national lockdown on March 24th with about 4 hours notice? Of course, the reasoning behind the lockdown was very sincere, in the sense that the idea was to stop the spread of the infection around India. And note, in the past pandemics of the plague, of influenza 100 years back, it is a fact that this disease spread across the world and across India through transport links. And so shutting down the entire transport network came from this idea that let's keep the migrants where they are. And because India's health infrastructure is so weak in rural areas relative to urban areas, it makes sense to buy some time so that rural areas can at least ramp up facilities and then maybe send back migrants in a certain sort of space. So that was the thinking behind the lockdown. Unfortunately, I don't think what the government realized was the scale of migrant workers, and more importantly, that if there is no economic security, if there's no assurance on wages, on basic supplies, there's panic. And that's exactly what we saw in the first week of late March, starting from March 24, but all through the last 2 months, there's a lot of anxiety and panic, to a point where after some time, the situation stabilized in the first week of April, when state governments started providing shelter to millions of people, millions of circular migrant workers in India. But still, across the board, you saw only one thing: migrant workers saying, we don't want food, we don't want shelter, we just want to go back home, right? And that's what we're seeing across construction projects, across a variety of places in India. That is, even if you provide all the services, migrant workers' reaction right now is to go back. So why is this the case? One is very simple. Even if we had family members, say, outside India, very close members, we would like them to come back home, especially if we knew that they were caught out in a high COVID-19 sort of a place. So for example, if I had a relative in Italy, which was badly affected, I would desperately want this relative of mine to come back home at the earliest. And that's precisely what the government of India did. We provided planes to Iran and Italy to get our migrant workers, not just migrants, but travelers, tourists who were stuck there, back home. Obviously, because a lot of anxiety. And so same thing happened internally in India. That is, people who are back home were very concerned with the news coming from Ahmedabad, Surat, Mumbai about the disease. And they said, look, we just want you back. There's also a cultural dimension. That is, when there's anxiety, a lot of migrant workers have said, marna hai to hum gaon mein marenge. That is, if you want to die, let us die with our families back. So there are a lot of reasons why migrants, even when they were provided with all the services, like in many states, the state governments did do a good job in providing shelter and food. The migrant psychology was such that we want to go back. Eventually, of course, because the transport system was still not open, a lot of migrant workers who had already started walking in April started walking in larger numbers in April and May first week, and it's still happening. And that happened because I would argue a slight miscommunication on transport about when it is going to start. And migrant workers who had registered for the train services were not getting the SMS saying that you have booked a berth. There was confusion over whether you have to pay tickets or not. And so there was a particular wave of migration, reverse migration, where migrants said, to hell with it, we are just going to start making our own arrangements to go back home. And that's when you saw this new wave of return migration through buses, through walking, and so on. And this is one of the most remarkable episodes in Indian migration history, where so many people started walking literally back. Now, I think I saw some question. A lot of people are interested to know the numbers. That is, how many people have gone back and so on. Of course, now the trains have started, over the last 10 days and so on. But I would place the number easily more than 10 million in the sense of after the lockdown. That is, people who moved after the lockdown being more than 10 million. Note, we are saying interstate migrant workers is roughly between 20 to 30 million, maybe more. But a huge part of that after the lockdown have gone back. Note that a lot of these migrants actually had gone back home before the lockdown, because usually a lot of migrants in North India go back home for festivals, Holi and so on. Right? And so Holi happened just a week before the lockdown. And so a lot of migrants had, in a way, luckily already gone back home. And a lot of them, of course, have gone back in the last 20 days or so. So the numbers are quite large, about more than 10 million or so. And just to give you a sense of the urban workforce, we say about a quarter of the urban workforce of India is migrant, right? The labor force of urban India. And so I would estimate easily more than half of that, which has gone back home right now. And so there's a huge labor shortage across sectors in India at the moment. Construction activities across the board, have stalled. And so it's a very dire situation that we find ourselves in, because now we want economic activities to resume, but there's simply no sort of workers. Now, a lot of questions that start coming up out here. Should the migrant workers have been allowed to go back home before the lockdown was announced, or as it happens now, 2 months after the lockdown? On hindsight, of course, I think the answer is very clear. It should have happened before because of two reasons. One, the infection rates at that time were very low, and so if people had gone back home, the case of the mass transmission was arguably very low. And two, if migrants had gone back home then, as the economy starts opening out now, migrants would have started coming back. Whereas now we find ourselves in a situation where migrants are going back home precisely at a time when infection rates are much higher, which means that the risk of transmission of the disease is much higher than it was in 2 months back. And also that migrants are going back home precisely when we need them, as the economy needs to start. So we find ourselves in a very bad situation right now. This is, of course, with hindsight. On March 24th, this information was not there. And what the government was working with was an estimate of how many migrants could have been infected. And the number they gave to this court was 1/3, which is an astronomically large number. Today we know that it's nowhere near that number. But I think they were playing on the safer side, and that's the reasoning for that decision. But anyway, now that decision is over. We find ourselves on May 23rd, 2 months after the lockdown, and we find ourselves in a situation where a huge reverse migration has happened. Some part of it has happened on very distressing conditions. A lot of people have also lost or become more malnutrition because of the walk, because of the conditions of the last 2 months. And a lot of people, definitely would have, lost weight. It also adds to a health crisis. The health of migrant workers is not the best. And so this sort of two-month lockdown, in many cases, would have also deteriorated some of these health conditions. Now what happens in terms of the policy circles? One sort of question was, about Manrega, that is the Rural Employment Guarantee Act, and how this might sort of affect migration. And the thing to note out there is that the Manrega is usually used by a particular migrant worker class, which is not the bulk of who is returning right now. What kind of works do Manrega projects usually do? It is a lot of construction activities, a lot of small projects with a particular skill profile, which most of these guys who are returning actually are at a much higher skill level. Right? So, for example, the guys who are in the power loom, workers in Surat, or even sort of the people in manufacturing clusters around Delhi, these are migrant workers, as I said, of the semi-permanent long-term migration type. These are not migrants who would anytime do Manrega work. To put it very bluntly, they're too rich to do Manrega work. So Manrega is very useful for a particular class of returning workers who are at the short-term seasonal migration level, working in brick kilns, construction site, who have returned and who now need sort of help. But the bulk of the returning workforce would not even think of Manrega. Right? So that's one thing to understand about Manrega and migration, in the sense that even when Manrega was there, they never really thought about it, and now when they go back, they're not really
Yes, definitely.
think about it. Do the Manrega wage hikes matter? It matters for, again, the particular class of migrant workers for whom it is often a choice between Manrega or short-term migration. And no, short-term migration typically gives you slightly higher wages than Manrega. That's why people opt for short-term migration. There, yes, so you might see some dampening effect on very, very short-term migration, but not on overall migration. There's a big question on whether this reverse migration is temporary or permanent, and it's a very important question because a lot of the journalists who have been covering this event across India have often posed this question to migrants, saying, "Will you come back?" And often the answer was no. We are left for good. And you have newspaper articles of thousands of auto rickshaw drivers driving off with autos from Bombay, saying, we are done with the city, we are going back for good, and so on. My sense is that this is a very temporary reverse migration and that people will come back much sooner, in fact, than we all think, though it will be delayed compared to previous years. So let me just talk a little bit about this. Reverse migration happens every year because of festivals. In the sense, millions of people board Indian trains around the time of Holi, Diwali, Chhath, different sort of time periods of the year, and go back. This year is unique in the sense that across the board, because different communities celebrate different festivals, and so it's not the case that at one point of time everyone go back. That is what is different this year. Right? So otherwise, this reverse migration has been happening every year. These reverse migrations also happen for the monsoon season. And there's a lot of people go back during end May and June for the 2 months of June, July, set the fields, and then they come back. Right? That's a huge part of the circular migration. What's different this year is that a lot of people have left or gone back 1 or 2 months before schedule, and I think a lot of them will come back 1 or 2 months after schedule. So what we're looking at this year is really 2 or 3 months of a severe labor shortage. And what the labor shortage will do is, in a very simple market mechanism, drive up prices, which means wages will start. It's already happening. Labor costs are going up at construction sites and so on. And so this wage hike, so it's very good for people who've not chosen to go back because they can negotiate, because it's a classic case of labor shortage leading to potentially better sort of compensation packages. And so once these wages start going up, it will be a market signal for migrants also to come back. And there are a lot of precedents to this. This is again not the first time. There are industry-wise recessions. So Surat is a city which I've studied reasonably closely. There are industry-wise recessions in Surat. People go back as prospects starts improving, they return, sometimes even in larger numbers. But most famously, the Indian pandemics of the plague or the influenza 100 years back, you found the same thing. Bombay's population, for example, halved. About 400,000 people left Mumbai after the plague of the late 19th century, 1896, 97. And the cotton textile mill owners of that time had to literally give a lot of sops and give a lot of benefits in order to retain workers back out there. And so when these workers came back, they came back with a slightly better sort of labor foothold in those cities. So this is one interesting labor market dynamic that we'll see this year. That is wages going up and in a way getting migrant workers back. Yes, there will be, of course, a few migrants who will be so distressed with this horrific experience of the last 2 months that they will make this decision of not coming back at all. Right? But in terms of numbers, I suspect it's going to be very small. That still means that you have millions of more migrant workers in the source regions for a few more months. And so that in itself is a huge policy question. And so not surprisingly, Bihar, West Bengal, Odisha, to some extent Madhya Pradesh, but especially UP and Rajasthan. So UP, Rajasthan, and Bihar, and West Bengal and Odisha, I would say the main states, to some extent Jharkhand. These states do have a real problem on hand of having millions. I mean, the number for Bihar is probably 3 million. So they have to manage basically 3 million Biharis who otherwise would not have been there for a few more months this year. And so that is a public policy question. Some of them, yes, will be engaged with Manrega. I think the best way to engage actually is for those who are, healthy, who are not affected by the disease at all, which is the majority. I think it makes sense to give some very quick skills on basic health management that is at the grassroots, because right now we are in an epidemic. COVID cases are going to go up and hopefully not too much, but they will go up, especially in some of the states where migrants are going back. And so you do need some basic work arrangements for managing quarantine facilities, managing food, managing camps. And I think that's a useful way in which some of this labor can also be utilized or reallocated for these few months. But most importantly, I think state governments have to start working as labor contractors and start finding out where are the labor gaps emerging and how can we provide assurances so that we can now, so suppose there's a demand for 10,000 workers in Tamil Nadu construction sites. How can me, if I'm the government of Bihar or UP, how can I provide safe and good working conditions for my migrant workers and actually allow my migrant workers to go? And so one line of thought says, this is a fantastic opportunity for people to actually focus on source regions and develop new jobs so that people actually don't have to go. I don't think that is feasible in the immediate short term. And I think a more pragmatic approach is that there is a demand shortfall in many states of India, and there's a supply oversupply of oversupply of people in many parts. And so it's essentially about how to match demand and supply across India. Workers need assurances. They've been treated fairly badly by employers, by governments. And so they need the assurances of wages. They need the assurances of variety of what we call as formalization happening, almost like a stopgap arrangement from the source region state government saying, we will provide you these assurances, but feel free to go to Andhra Pradesh, Tamil Nadu, Kerala, Mumbai, or wherever you want to work, and we will work out an arrangement with that state to make it happen. These arrangements, by the way, do happen at a sub-state level already. For example, Kerala has a department called NORCA. It is for non-resident Keralites. And this is the nodal department in the Kerala government, which looks after the sort of broad concerns of Keralites who are in the Gulf. Right? And in India, unfortunately, we don't have such departments at the state government. So Bihar should, for example, quickly open a department, even a ministry, given the numbers, of how to productively engage with migrant workers and ensure that this kind of very precarious nature of their jobs ends, and follow up with MOUs, follow up with arrangements with others. For example, Orissa has an MOU with Tamil Nadu on particular sectors saying, there is a particular migration wave from Orissa to Tamil Nadu, Andhra Pradesh, in terms of brick kiln work, and how do we provide safe facilities for these migrants, and how to provide creche facilities on site and so on. So there are examples of interstate migration coordination mechanisms in India, and I think that has to be ramped up in a big level. And so yesterday we saw Bihar government coming out saying we are thinking about doing this. I think that's a welcome step. I think this idea of keeping migrants in a place and developing source regions is it's infeasible, and it's very unlikely to happen. And as I started off by saying, this idea that, for example, this is a great time for Bihar's out-migration to stop. The fundamental driving force of these migrations is extremely high population density. And as I said, Bihar will take 2 or 3 decades to reach where Kerala is today. There is no guarantee that migration will stop with development. In fact, the evidence in India suggests that with more rural development, you get more out-migration. Often with more roads, more connectivity, people actually start living even more. And that's not a bad thing. Most societies in the world have moved a huge part of their workforce from agriculture to non-agricultural sectors, China most famously. And India also needs to do that. It should not happen in a distress mechanism. So there are 2 kinds of movement out of agriculture. One is because the rain falls, because there's extreme distress, what people call as push factors. And so obviously we don't want to see those kinds of migrations. And so rural development has to happen to reduce those factors. But one should not be naive to say that with rural development, people will stop leaving. In fact, in India's most agriculturally fertile regions, people like Punjab and coastal Andhra, it's very fertile lands, but there's huge out-migration from those places to nearby towns. In the case of Punjab, to Canada and Italy. In the case of coastal Andhra, to places like Guntur, Hyderabad, or even the United States. So, there are a lot of important policy challenges in the immediate short term, which I've talked about very, very briefly. There is this whole point about portable social security, which is very important. The idea, as I started out, one of the reasons why people panic, why migrants panic, is that if I don't have my daily or monthly income, I have to go back home. And so if you have portable social security, which means if you can access facilities to health at a subsidized cost, if you can access even rice, for example, the PDS system anywhere in India, that is a completely different way of engaging with migrants, right? Because India has had a policy bias of domicile-based welfare service. That is where you're born, we'll provide you welfare services there. Whereas a lot of us have been arguing for a long time now that we need to move to an architecture of portable social security, which would mean mainly PDS and health. And so, it's good to know that the government is thinking on these lines. It was supposed to be rolled out on June 1st. I think it's been postponed to March 1. This is something called as a one nation, one ration card policy. And I think that a step up in the policy plane for migrant workers. Beyond that, there are concerns about labor laws, about treating migrant workers fairly, not being hostile to migrant workers. I mean, there is an article in the Indian Constitution which provides for free mobility of people, except for few parts of India, you can go anywhere and work. But more and more in the last 1 year, we've seen state governments becoming very nativist, saying that basically having quotas, 80% of jobs should be for only locals and so on. These are fairly anti-constitutional provisions because in India, in theory, almost anywhere you can go and I'll also end by talking about the major corridors which have emerged in the last few years. Historically, this northern cluster that you saw was mainly towards Western India, that is this arc between Delhi and Mumbai. Whereas now in the last decade, we are seeing massive north to south migration. So a lot of, I mentioned this, Bihar or UP or West Bengal to Kerala, but also Tamil Nadu, also Andhra Pradesh, also Karnataka. Earlier, there was a language divide. So people, Hindi-speaking migrants could not really work in Tamil Nadu. But today, the wage differences are so high that people don't mind learning the new language or somehow managing because the economic returns are much higher of those migrations. So north to south migrations have also sort of increased. Note, almost every country in the world has gone through a phase of moving out of agriculture into non-agriculture through rural to urban migration. In the case of most countries in Europe, it happened through mass migration to the Americas. It happened between roughly 1870 and 1914, what is known as the age of mass migration. People from Italy, people from Britain, that's how people escaped or left agriculture to other productive areas. And in India, unfortunately, the numbers going abroad are very less. So it has to happen within India. And if you see India's relatively more prosperous areas, whether it's Tamil Nadu, whether it's Gujarat, whether it's Maharashtra, or even Kerala, we have seen a process of rural to urban migration. So clamping down on rural to urban migration does not make any policy sense. And the policy discourse is now moving away to saying, how do we facilitate safe migrations? How do we facilitate better migration? There's a question on, how can cities be more welcoming to migrants? Because I think one of the things that's really come out in the last 2 months is the sheer sort of hostility which a lot of migrants have expressed very openly to journalists and variety of other people, saying we never really felt belong. We never really felt that we belonged in the cities. But what this incident shows is that it's literally as if nobody even cares, right? And so immediately the wages stopped. If you're employing domestic help, immediately the domestic help also wage stopped. And so the brutality faced in the city was so severe that a lot of people just left in terms of the disgust. And I think going forward, one major lesson that has to be learned from this crisis is how do we make our cities more welcome for migrant workers. One is at the political level, that is not having pointless political slogans saying anti-migrant sort of slogans, not blaming migrants for everything, but also acknowledging the massive contribution migrant workers make to economies. And that's what we're going to find out in the next few months. A lot of cities are going to be running at very less capacity because of the shortage of migrant workers. Now, how do we do that? Now, some are at the very big policy question. So one major concern is housing, for example. Housing conditions of migrant workers are really bad. In this whole thing of social distancing, it was a joke because really migrants in cities cannot practice social distancing. The houses are really cramped up. They're living in very, they're trying to minimize costs, but that's also because there's simply a dearth of supply of affordable housing in India and a dearth of supply of rental accommodation in India. So on the housing side, we need to invest much more in affordable rental housing because the preference for these migrants is to go back home, most of them. And even who want to settle, the idea in the beginning at least is to rent. Whereas our entire policy bias on the housing sector in India has been towards home ownership. So how do we provide more rental options in cities? That is, definitely one on the agenda. But I think also city governments need to start engaging much more with migrants in understanding what their concerns are. The fundamental reason why migrants have been treated so shabbily in the last 2 months is because they have absolutely no political voice. Because when migrants leave a state and go to another state, they are typically not voting in that state, and they're typically not voting in the state that they're coming from. Though, of course, many state governments try and pull back migrant workers before the time of election. And precisely because you don't have political voice, this is an invisible class of workers in India, which for the first time in the last 2 months have become visible because of this desperation. And so I think one thing is for political parties to engage, but there's less incentive to do so. And that is why I think civil society, all of us, have to be much more alert and sensitive to sort of the concerns and needs of migrant workers. So I'll stop there, and I'll be happy to take questions from you. Thanks.
Chinmay, thanks a lot. There are many questions in chat box. Would you like me to read, or would you read yourself and answer them? You're on mute, Chinmay.
Yeah, I'll go through this. There were some which also were on email. I think I answered the one on like cities welcoming. I just made a brief mention of that. There's one on the PMGSY, so Pradhan Mantri Gram Sadak Yojana, and the idea that this massive rural roads program that the government has done, has it actually increased migration? I mean, wasn't this all about rural development, Gram Sadak Yojana? Isn't it counterproductive? That is, you're building roads for villagers, but they're actually using those roads to move out of villages. Now, how does one see this policy? I think the PMGSY is a fantastic policy, just because, building good quality roads, if it is happening, is a general public good which must be celebrated. But to see it as a failure because most people are moving out is again counterproductive. I think we have to understand that people in general will be moving out of agriculture, whether we like it or not. And so to the extent that roads, one way to see it is in terms of incentivizing migration, but roads, it cuts down transport time in the logistics of agricultural goods. It cuts down time to your school. It cuts down time to your nearest nursing home. So there are a lot of benefits of this. Right? There are some studies on PMGSY. A person who asked this question, I would say, there's work by Sam Asher and others who have looked at the benefits of this. It turns out that the benefits seem to be overstated, but it's no doubt. But there is some occupational diversification which has happened thanks to the PMGSY. So I would argue that even if it has increased outmigration, it should not be seen as a failure. Good quality roads in every part of India should be seen as a public good in its own intrinsic sort of right, rather than increasing or decreasing migration. There was a question on reverse migration. Will it lead to more caste violence? Will it lead to more panchayat? How will it affect panchayat politics? I would say that this is going to be a very temporary affair in my view, unless of course the disease is there for a long time. Okay, having one of the things I study is history, and so I'm well aware that pandemics in the past have not necessarily subsided in a few months. The influenza, for example, in 1918 was there for just literally 2 months, killed 15 million Indians, and then went away. But the plague, which started in 1896, lasted in India for almost 25 years. Right? So it depends on how this COVID-19 is going to behave. But just taking a point from the plague, after the initial panic, in which just like today, millions of people went back home, they came back and they learned to live with the plague. Right? And so I think that's what we're going to see in India, that people are going to start living with this disease around us with some sort of precautionary measures taken, or accepting slightly higher death rates than normal. That's precisely what happened in the time of
Chinmay, how do you relate to the federal structure of India and with migration, how managing migration?
Yeah, I'll just come to that federal point. I'll just respond to this thing on panchayat politics and so on. So because it's a temporary thing, I don't think it's going to fundamentally alter panchayat politics. Will it lead to more caste violence? I don't think. I think these few months is a very small time. I should mention that historically, outmigration has been a fantastic way of changing caste relations in villages. Me and Kalyani Vartak have a paper on this. We studied one village using baseline data over 50 years, and we found outmigration which was historically confined only to the upper ranking caste. When it became a pan-caste basis, different castes started getting identity. As people started becoming rich through migration, there was actually less, the caste distinctions don't go away, but more caste sort of assertion, identity assertion. And so in that sense, people get more voice through migration. And that is why the most famous proponent of, for example, Dalit rights in India, Ambedkar loved migration. He thought migration is the best way to break India's caste system. Obviously, it has not happened, but caste in urban India is substantially different than in rural India. And so, in my book, I've argued between these two extremes views on migration. The Gandhian view, which is that celebrating the rural life, that rural to urban migration is bad, it should not happen, versus the Ambedkarite view, which says that no, the cities are the sites of liberation. So they're two completely contrasting views. And I sort of take the Ambedkarite position, that is, rural to urban migration should happen, and it's one of the ways in which caste relations can be remolded, if not completely sort of reversed. So this question on federal structure, I think what this crisis has shown is that nobody really knows how many migrants are there in each state of India. I mean, the first questions I started getting at the time of the crisis from different people was, how many people are there? How many people from UP are there in Gujarat? Because the UP government wants to arrange buses. So, for example, how many people are there in Gujarat? And we have some numbers from the census, we have some estimates, but the Gujarat government finally did a survey, and the number turned out to be almost 1.5 times to double of what a lot of people had estimated. The final number was 2.1 million people had registered to go back outside Gujarat. That's an underestimate. And all this time, the census was saying 500,000 to 1 million people. So we have to be careful that state governments have to have a better idea about who is working in their states. And I think this portable social security can do that. I think what this crisis has also revealed is better coordination between center state and state to state. I think what we saw in this crisis was a lot of needless issues. For example, states saying we won't take our migrants back because otherwise our numbers will look bad. Right? So I think that was really pointless. If the Odisha migrant worker is stuck in Gujarat and is desperate to go back home after 50 days, the Odisha government or the West Bengal government or whichever government, I think, has to start taking them back, just like how the Indian government started taking back people from outside India. And so better state-to-state coordination is important. And I think having a department in the major sending states, like UP, Bihar, Odisha, and so on, having a department there for the welfare of out-of-state migrant workers, I think the time has come for that. I also think in order to actually implement this one nation, one ration card policy, we will need some sort of an interstate migration council, just like we have the GST council for goods and service movement across states. We have an interstate GST council, which deliberates on a variety of issues, because of course, that is of course backed by, by law. I think even an interstate migration council or a committee is important, because what we're going to see now is, we're going to see some conflicts arising from this one nation, one ration, if it actually happens. That is, why should the Maharashtrian government procure food grains through the Food Corporation of India for the welfare of migrant workers coming from other states? And who's going to pay for this? So there's a huge question mark on who's going to pay for this one nation, one ration card scheme. And I think we need an interstate migration council to basically sort out the fiscal issues of this. So yes, federal structure of India is very important. The starting principle is that migration by the Constitution of India is allowed. No, there is nothing restricting migration in India internally, barring for a few pockets of India. Right? And so constitutionally, even a reservation of, famous court cases have been won in India when you've had reservations on the basis of location, saying that, that migration is feasible for everybody. So yeah, I think broadly these would be my points on the federal structure.
Okay. Should I read more questions, Chinmay?
Yeah, sure. Because I've not seen where the questions are.
Okay, so there are questions related to migration and labor laws. Different states are now coming up with new labor laws or modification of labor laws. What would be your view on these modifications of laws? And especially now with the new laws, would that weaken the social security of labor?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think there are two ways to look at this. One is a lot of people have been arguing for more flexible labor markets, arguing that Industrial Disputes Act is a major hindrance to employing more people and so on. But I think even that argument made by a lot of economists, everyone, came about with this argument that let us have more flexible labor markets, provided we have a social safety net backed by the government. Right? So you have more liberal labor laws from the point of view of the employer, as long as you have a very strong social safety net, which could be a universal basic income, a variety of things, which is backed by the government. Now, we've not yet moved to that architecture, which means we're making hiring, firing very simple, But at the same time, we don't have the unemployment insurance. We don't have a variety of social security measures, which, for example, America has in India. So one is you cannot move to a system of so-called flexible labor laws without having this alternative. The other point is I thought the primary problem which a lot of people were arguing about labor laws was to make it simpler, make it easier to comply with, and mainly around the Industrial Disputes Act. Whereas I think what's unfortunate is that at least a few state governments have amended a lot more than what was the concern points. For example, minimum wages. Nowhere in the world is there a debate on the existence of minimum wages. It is about how high the minimum wages should be. Whereas we've unfortunately gone to a step where we say in order to induce investment, even minimum wages should be scrapped. So I think some labor laws are sacrosanct, non-negotiable. Some need reform, and I think we should have focused on that. In any case, as Azim Premji himself has said, it seems that labor laws have been weakened so much over the last 20 years that is not the principal constraint faced by firms in India anymore. At least that's what Azim Premji says. And the main constraints are in terms of credit, in terms of financing, and so on, which hopefully is also getting attention of the government. So my take is that this current sort of impetus on labor laws needs to have much more thinking behind it. I think it's been thought through very lightly. How will it affect migration? Well, not so much in the sense, in terms that migrant workers anyway work fairly precariously, and to the extent that a lot of these laws are being weakened, it will make it even more precarious. I think if there is a general need for more so-called liberal laws, you also need to be voicing out very strongly for a strong social security net, like America has, like Western Europe has. That is, if you lose your job, you can rely on the government to give you some money for some period of time. Do we have that architecture yet? I don't think so. And so that is why I think one has to be very careful when one talks about labor laws and have a good balance. You don't want to antagonize labor or capital. You want to have a nice balance between them in India.
Chinmay, let's take some live questions. We have Salil Shetty and Abhishek Anand. Salil will ask his question first, and then Abhishek. Salil, please ask your question.
Thank you. Chinmay, this is Salil here, and thank you for, I think I certainly learned a great deal. I've not thought about the subject that much. So my question, Chinmay, was that, and you kind of touched on it briefly, that the caste composition of the different categories of migrants, particularly the poorest, I think what you call the circular migrants. Could you just tell us if we have information data on that? And did that have any bearing on the way in which the state or societies responded to this crisis?
Yeah, I mean, very quickly, there's a paper, it's there on my website, it's called Migration and Caste. As you move from so-called, as you move up the caste hierarchy, more propensity of out-migration for longer-term circular migrations and lesser propensity for shorter-term migration, and it's the inverse, which means, for example, Dalit migrants from, say, Bihar are more likely to move for shorter distance, 3-month kind of migrations than 10-month or even 5-year kind of migrations. So there are these two clear hierarchies. In shorter term migrations, the lower ranking castes of India are more likely to move, and in longer durations migrations, it's the reverse. When you actually put the numbers together, it evens out, right? Which means everyone is pretty much on the move in the same propensity. In this particular crisis, if you're asking, who is moving back, I would argue everyone. It cuts across castes, which means why? Because you're looking at short-term as well as long-term circular migrants. And I mean, if you look at the security guards who work, there's an overrepresentation of general and OBC category, right? Even among security guards. And these are what I call the 10-month migrant workers. Whereas you look at the brick kiln or the construction site workers, there's an underrepresentation of the general and OBC category. So there's a clear sort of mixing that's happening in terms of the caste hierarchy. So in terms of who's going back, this affects everyone, right? So I wouldn't say that there's a particular caste angle to the reverse migration. A lot of people across castes in India have been affected by the current.
Thanks. Abhishek, your thoughts?
Yes, actually, before I go to my question, actually, these details that what you're presenting here is relatively, 2007, 2008. Is there a, I mean, latest data which shows a different picture?
Of on a variety of things I said. I mean, see,
Yes.
in terms of the broad, in terms of new corridors, yeah, the thing that's different from 2007-8 is north to south migration, right? But the hotspots, the chart I showed you, which is 2007-8, is pretty much the same today. And I say this because this chart has not really changed for literally 100 years, right? And that's the big argument of the book that I've written. That is, these hotspots are hotspots now, almost like culturally hotspots. That is, you grow up in these regions which have mass out migration. There might be new hotspots which have emerged, especially in the Deccan, right? For example, Raichur now we know is a huge hotspot of out-migration, which is not adequate in 2007-8. So there are some new clusters which have emerged, and we know that through fieldwork, through anecdotal studies, through sort of ground-level studies and so on. But I would argue that 2007-8 map is still a very good map to understand out-migration in India on aggregate, and it matches very well with numbers from railway statistics, which are more recent. It matches reasonably well with I'll tell you, it matches really well, for example, with the Gujarat government's exercise of last month. So this number of 2.1 million, though the absolute numbers are higher than what the census of the National Sample Service said, the distribution across states is almost identical to what the NSS was saying. So how many migrants are there in Gujarat? You know, what percentage is from UP, what percentage is from Bihar, what percent from, say, Orissa? That percentage distribution is pretty much the same from what the Gujarat government found out 3 weeks ago. Right? And so that is why we say we trust the census and NSS in terms of the distributions, but not in terms of the absolute magnitudes, which we've been arguing are on the underestimate size. So the absolute magnitude of migration is much more than what the NSS and census is saying, but the distribution, the propensities, I don't think that has changed that much.
Okay.
Chinmay, there is a question about India having a social security policy on lines of Ayushman Bharat and Manrega. I thought you already touched that, but if in case you want to add more to that, please.
Yeah, I think the big social security policy everyone's talking about is UBI, that is Universal Basic Income. How should it be targeted? Should it be for everyone? To give you the example, analogy of the board game Business or Monopoly, I'm sure many of you have played or seen this game. You know, when you play this game called Monopoly or Business, you know, oftentimes you lose a lot of money, but at the end, when you come to that starting position, you get some 100 rupees, right? And that is pretty much what the UBI is saying, is that things can go wrong, but at the end of, at some point, you know, you get this magic 100 rupees, which gives you one more shot at life. Right? So that's what the social security sort of system, which as this crisis is showing, you know, if there was some cash, it would go a long way in giving some security. So Ayushman Bharat, fantastic policy on a variety of grounds. You know, I mean, a lot of good things which have happened in terms of public policy. But I don't think there is a clear, like Jan Dhan also has to some extent done good things, Manrega, for example. But, you know, this idea that if you lose a job, you still live a very precarious life. You have nothing to fall back to, is what this crisis is showing us. Right? And so we need a way of maybe unemployment insurance or you know, some sort of a direct cash injection to needy households. I think that is a very direct form of social security. Is typically economists have long quarreled about this, but surprisingly, you're seeing a consensus across the world towards giving more social security now. Given this, the scale, I mean, you know, we are now in a recession year. Almost all estimates suggest that this is a year of recession for India, and so we do need some sort of an injection through social. So when I talk of social security, all what you pointed out, Ayushman Bharat, they are useful, but I think we need something more than that.
There is a question from Sushant Kumar. Would more on-roll laborers by factories have helped lower reverse migration?
Yeah, I mean, what would have, you know, really helped would have been maybe a more staggered lockdown, which exited from April 15th itself. So obviously, if, you know, firms had started some operations, less people would have gone back, and that's exactly what Surat has done in the last week. They've started some power loom operators because they panicked. You know, almost 2 million people are planning to leave. And so they started some operations saying, no, we'll pay you and so on. The really tricky part was, of course, because MSMEs were hit so badly, they were not going to pay the wages, and hence, you know, the workers also were caught out. So both MSMEs and workers were caught out in this. So yes, I mean, you know, at some point, maybe the lockdown extended for far too long and so on. But, you know, there is a case to be made. I work in the field of economics. There are people who work in epidemiology, and this is, I think, what this crisis has shown is a classic sort of tiff between the economists and the epidemiologists. Right? So epidemiologists, the main focus is on reducing deaths, and economists, the main focus is on having a decent GDP growth. And there's obvious trade-off in that in this crisis. And so the economist is going to tell you that this lockdown should not have happened, or should have happened in a very smooth manner, or the migrants should have gone back home lower. But the politician is going to listen more to the epidemiologist, because if you have 500,000 deaths, you can't sell that politically. But if you have a minus 5% GDP growth, that's fine. So this is fundamentally a policy question.
Chinmay, there is a question by Mahesh. Are there any positives that you see in last 2 months?
The positive will come in the financial year 2021-2022, because this year our economy will contract, and then the next year the economy will expand very big because of the base effect. So that will be the good news. That number might be more than 10%. India might have its record GDP growth, not this year but the next year, just because of a bounce back. The good news in the sense of the fact that a labor shortage like this will drive up wages, will lead firms to maybe change practices. And I think there's a whole public policy advocacy group in India which is going to push through a lot of stuff for labor. What we've seen in the short term is actually the opposite. That is, labor laws being weakened and so on. But I do think that this year you will see a lot of political voice being raised for labor, for migration. And in India, I'm convinced that nothing happens unless it's in the political agenda. And so I think this will be a huge agenda for politicians to consider this year. And so something good might come out, like the 1991 crisis. Like every crisis, something good has to come out of it at the end. So one has to be optimistic and hope that some good things come out of it. But there's no doubt that this is a very painful year economically.
Chinmay, once there's an interesting question by Ritika, and we have seen what happened when this migration started. Now, what Ritika asks is, what should the government, especially local governments, do to prepare for return of these migrants? At least that we can manage well, I hope. So that's a question very interesting. So what should the governments, local governments do to prepare mass return of migrants to source regions? Okay, that's okay. That's still,
Yeah, I mean, the main thing is to keep the transport open. I mean, if you have the Indian Railways work, I mean, this is one of the things I've been arguing the last 1 month. Much of my initial research on migration happened on the train. I would, sit with migrants and talk to them. This is almost a decade back during my PhD work. And the Indian Railways, is not just a means of transport. It's like a symbol of hope. If the railways are working, it means things are okay. And so this complete shutdown of the railways is a psychological shock, because the fact that you can't go from point A to point B across, say, more than 300-400 kilometers is a huge psychological blow. And so that is why all these, this reverse migration people will come back, as long as you say that the trains are out and, we're not going to start the trains on a selective basis. Whole train service is open. In fact, we should be running more trains for migrant workers to come back and so on. So yes, in terms of planning, have a good, efficient, have the transport options open, but in a few months in a big manner. And I think eventually we have to move to a system of living with the disease, like at the time of the plague, because I think that's what governments around the world are slowly going to do, because the economic impact of any more severe lockdown is going to be quite devastating. So far we've been successful in containing deaths compared to some other countries. But now there's also malnutrition and malnutrition related deaths, which could spike up in the later part of the year. And so we have to be concerned about that. In terms of jobs, I think this is a great opportunity for host state governments. So like Bihar and UP, as I said, to start that department. And now as these guys are going back, like we have this health app, we should have a migration app. And all these people were saying, this app which has banking remittance facilities, it has railway train booking facilities, it has a portal towards jobs, and this is something the state governments can actually creatively do at this stage, so that they also have a sense of how many migrants are going out from their state. And no, these state governments rely hugely on these migrant workers through remittances. A huge part of the consumption economy of Bihar, UP, or for that matter Kerala, is run by remittances. And so once the Gulf is affected, Kerala is also affected. And so I think that more than the destination sites, I think the host state governments have to creatively engage. I think Bihar is doing a very nice thing. They're doing a simple skill mapping of all the people who've come back. so that it's easier to match skills, across the board. And this is what Norca has been doing in Kerala with the Gulf, right? And so how do you get better job opportunities for your people outside? This might seem counterintuitive. Aren't you supposed to be doing, as a government, aren't you supposed to be providing jobs for your people in your own state? Why are you trying to actually facilitate people going outside your state? But this is how migration works. And a lot of smart labor migration strategies have actually done this. South Korea, which today is this fantastic country as an example of a variety of virtues. In the 70s and 80s, South Korea was like Kerala, exporting a large number of people to the Gulf, purposely, right? Because they had a lot of people who were moving out of agriculture, and they said, this is a fantastic way for them to move, get skills, get money, send it back to us, and we can spur up our own activities. So a lot of countries have used or captured the benefits of out-migration in very creative ways. And so Kerala is doing that to some extent. And I think all these state governments have to wake up and start having these engagements with these migrants. Right now, the only engagement is at the time of elections, you take some politicians to the other cities and then say, okay, why don't you come back, press the voting button and then go back. And so it's more like a get the workers back for a voting catchment area. But I think the time for a more systematic way of engagement is probably there now.
Chinmay, there is a question that earlier from Priyank Agarwal. Earlier, government said lockdown is important. Now it says that economy is important. So are they trying hit and trial mechanism?
It is. I think you'll see that, it's not just India. I think governments across the world have gone through this cycle. And the more, because again, I do history, it's very similar. Pandemics have this very similar problem. There are these stages of pandemics. First is refusal to accept that there is, right? So if you saw in February, it's like even in March 10, the government said there is no health crisis in India. So the first thing is refusal. The second is randomness. Right? And this is not my theory. There's a particular epidemiologist who has this 5-stage theory of pandemic. First is refusal, then randomness. That is, you have no idea what is going to happen, and then you cook up any policy that comes to mind. And then you have like a reaction. Right? Okay, now this is a crisis. Now we March 24th lockdown, and then we'll see it later. And then slowly a reaction as to how it happened. And then finally, you just have to live with it. What could we have done better? In a way, the question is, pointless because it's like a hindsight bias. But having said that, on migration, because I work on it, it was very clear before the lockdown that a lot of people wanted to go back. And there was no two questions about it, that they should have allowed people to go back at that time so that people could have come back when the economy was going to open up. And when the transmission rates were much low. Now the transmission rates are much high. So like this thing about, the disease versus economy, it's a trial and error in the sense that it's about how much information you have. And I think we have more information now about the disease. We have more information about the transmission. We have more information about the case fatality rates. And so it does seem that maybe this is a possible, maybe there are ways in which we can live with the disease. Initially, that information was still very sparse. So I wouldn't say it's not a trial and error. It's more like coping with more information. Though of course I'll be very blunt and say that there were some serious policy mistakes done as well.
We take two more questions, Chinmay. One is, what is your long-term view? Will migrants continue to be part of the informal sector, or should there be greater efforts to bring them into the organized workforce?
Yeah, I mean, this bigger question on formalization and so on, we've been trying to do this for a long time, not in right earnest. If you ask me, is formalization a good thing? Right now, 90% or 70% of the urban workforce is informal. No two questions about that. The problem is how do you make it formal when so many of our firms are very small and do face a very high compliance cost in terms of bureaucracy, intervention and so on. So we have to incentivize formalization. I think that is a smarter way than a license Raj way of formalization. Our current approach has been a labor inspector who will go and check and to see if you're formal. You have to give incentive for you to become formal. Right? I think that's a smarter way of formalization as a strategy. And I'll also add that many times in the world of circular migration, migrant workers themselves prefer informal arrangements. Right? This is not a very popular view because typically when we say informality, it is seen as a bad word because firms are, escaping labor laws and so on. But because workers have one foot in the village and one foot in the city, they also sometimes prefer having contracts which are flexible, which they can go back home anytime. There's some illness in the house, they don't have to actually be there. They can just quickly go back and come back. So informality works both ways, at the employer end and at the worker end. If you can incentivize employers to become more formal, of course, workers will benefit tremendously. Will it happen? I'm very skeptical. I don't think. I'm very skeptical of formalization happening very soon. It would need a massive policy push. It would mean making everything compulsory, and if you do that, there will be a backlash on compliance. So I think. So it's a very tough question. I really don't have an answer. Maybe there are labor law experts who are better off talking about it.
My last question we'll take today. As a business history scholar, have you come across cases of how many businesses in India and abroad handled pandemics in the past? Could you discuss a few of them?
It's a good question. One is, of course, pandemics are times where startups fail big time. That's not a surprise. For example, 1918, the 2 months, not only registration fell, the firms which were created in those 2 months basically died very quickly, right? And so there's the mortality of human beings, but there's also the mortality of firms. And the firms, those firms which were created in the pandemic here, did not have very lasting success. Not surprisingly, the firms which have working capital, which have cash on hand, tend to be more resilient to these things. I actually have done work, not in the context of pandemics, but the Great Depression, 1930s. In the pandemic, influenza, 1918, I've seen a bit. But if you see Tata Steel, which is one of India's longest running companies, very big, a lot of companies had massive setbacks during 1918. I should say, 1918 was India's worst macroeconomic year on record. I mean, forget the 15 million deaths, which is also a demographic disaster. India had a negative GDP growth of 10%. That is India's worst real GDP growth rate since between 1900 and today. Right? And what's going to be interesting is that this year, again, we're going to have a really bad GDP growth rate. So the two worst GDP growth rates in recorded Indian economic history have been due to pandemics. One was 1918, and one was influenza 1918, and one is COVID now. And not surprisingly, but if you have a GDP growth rate of -5 or -10%, businesses, a lot of businesses do tend to get wiped out, and that is what we've seen. Broadly, what builds up resilience? The short answer is, if you're lucky and you have cash at that time, you're better off. If there are any particular strategies which help you manage, I'm not the best expert on that, but a lot of my colleagues are. And so there'll be more talks, I'm sure, that Sanjay will arrange on that.
Thanks a lot, Chinmay. Thanks a lot. You have really explained to us the reasons of migration, the way they have happened in the past, and you have shown how these challenges can be met. I think in a very balanced view, you have helped us to understand what was the response of government and why that response was, not criticizing either government or organizations. I think with this, we have been able to understand the issue of migration in much more detail. Thanks, Chinmay, to you for coming on this forum and sharing your views. I hope we'll see you once again once this issue of migration settles down.
Thank you.